In the heart of the jungle, where survival is a daily battle, one man is about to face a moment that will change his life forever. Jacob moved silently through the thick foliage, his rifle steady in his hands. His breath was slow, measured, just as it had been on every hunt before. The jungle around him was alive, the rustling of leaves, the distant cries of birds, the soft hum of insects hidden beneath the undergrowth. But none of it distracted him. His eyes were locked ahead, scanning the dense green maze for movement. Years of experience had taught him to read the smallest signs: a broken branch, a fresh footprint, a shift in the wind. And now he was close. A flicker of movement caught his eye. His fingers instinctively tightened around the rifle, his pulse quickening. He pushed forward, parting the vines carefully, and then he saw it. A massive silverback gorilla, standing tall among the towering trees. Its dark, piercing eyes met his, calm yet powerful. Jacob inhaled sharply, gripping his rifle tighter. This was the moment. This was what he had come for. He had taken down countless animals before, but this felt different. The gorilla didn't move, it didn't snarl, didn't run. It simply watched him, holding its ground with an unshakable presence. Jacob felt an unexpected chill run down his spine. Something about those eyes, those scars etched into the gorilla's thick hide, made him pause. His finger hovered over the trigger, but his body resisted. It was as if the jungle itself had gone silent, waiting, watching. What if I told you? This gorilla wouldn't just survive this encounter, but would change the hunter's life forever? Jacob had never questioned his way of life. Hunting had been his trade since he was a boy, a skill passed down through generations. The jungle was not a place of beauty to him. It was a battlefield where the strong prevailed and the weak perished. He had learned to move without sound, to strike without hesitation. Every animal he tracked was just another prize, another source of income, another proof of his survival. Poaching had been his reality for years. The demand for rare animal parts was high, and with every hunt, he earned enough to survive. Silverbacks were among the most valuable. Their hands, their heads, even their bones could fetch small fortunes on the black market. It was a dangerous business, but to Jacob, it was necessary. The jungle took, and he took in return. But as he stood face to face with this gorilla, something shifted. The weight of the rifle in his hands suddenly felt heavier. He could see the deep scars along the animal's arms, the marks of past battles, the silent proof of its struggles. This was not just a target. This was a survivor, a king of the jungle, standing unshaken in the face of a hunter. Jacob had always thought of himself as the predator, but for the first time, he wasn't sure. He had spent years chasing animals through the forest, believing that they were nothing more than resources to be claimed. But in this moment, as he stared into the gorilla's unwavering eyes, a question crept into his mind. Was he the hunter, or had he become the hunted by his own conscience? Jacob's breath was steady, his grip firm on the rifle. Every instinct told him to act, to take the shot before the moment slipped away. Yet his body refused to move. The gorilla stood its ground, broad chest rising and falling with slow, deliberate breaths. It wasn't afraid. It wasn't angry. It just watched him. The jungle around them seemed frozen in time, the usual symphony of rustling leaves and distant calls now replaced by an eerie stillness. Then the silverback did something Jacob didn't expect. It let out a deep, low rumble. Not a warning, not a growl, but something softer, something that almost sounded sorrowful. The sound reverberated through Jacob's chest, sinking into his bones. His heartbeat, which had been racing just moments before, slowed. His finger hovered over the trigger, unmoving. And then, from behind the massive figure, something stirred. A small, delicate movement. Jacob squinted, adjusting his stance. Emerging cautiously from behind the towering silverback was a baby gorilla. its wide, curious eyes peeking out from the safety of its protector's presence. The young one clung to its father's thick fur, its tiny fingers gripping tightly as it studied the unfamiliar figure before them. Jacob felt an unexpected lump in his throat. This wasn't just a silverback. It was a father, a guardian shielding his child, just as any human would. The realization sent a sharp jolt through him. He had spent years convincing himself that animals were nothing more than a means to an end, but at this moment, staring at the gentle yet fierce protectiveness in the gorilla's stance, he could no longer pretend. This wasn't a hunt. It never had been. The jungle seemed to exhale as the silverback remained still, unwavering in its quiet defiance. Jacob's hands, once so sure, now trembled ever so slightly. The rifle suddenly felt foreign in his grip, like an instrument of destruction he no longer recognized. The baby gorilla blinked, tilting its head, unaware of the silent war raging inside the man who had once seen them only as trophies. Jacob's pulse pounded in his ears as he stood frozen, the weight of his rifle heavier than ever. The silverback remained still, its deep, intelligent eyes locked onto his. There was no aggression, no fear, only an unspoken understanding. The baby gorilla clung to its father's fur, shifting slightly, its small fingers gripping tightly as if sensing the tension in the air. The moment stretched between them, fragile yet powerful, like a thread holding together two entirely different worlds. Then, the gorilla did something Jacob never expected. It took a slow step forward. Just one. Not a charge, not a threat, just a step. A deliberate move that spoke louder than any sound could. Jacob's fingers twitched on the rifle, every muscle in his body screaming for him to act, to do what he had always done. But he didn't. He couldn't. The silverback's scars, the wisdom in its gaze, the baby nestled against its chest. These were not the signs of a beast. They were the marks of a survivor, a protector, a father. And suddenly Jacob saw himself reflected in those eyes. The years he had spent in the jungle, surviving by taking life, all led to this moment. The realization hit him like a crashing wave. He wasn't looking at prey. He was looking at something far greater. For the first time in his life, he hesitated. Not out of fear, but out of something deeper, something unfamiliar. The jungle that had always felt like a hunting ground now felt like something else entirely. A home, a sanctuary, a place where life fought desperately to exist, just like he did. Jacob slowly lowered his rifle. His heart hammered against his ribs, but his hands no longer shook. The silverback let out another low rumble, its gaze steady, as if acknowledging the choice that had just been made. The baby gorilla blinked up at Jacob, then buried its face in its father's fur, unaware of how close it had come to losing everything. The silence between them was no longer tense, no longer filled with the weight of death. It was something else now, a truce. An unspoken bond formed in the depths of the jungle, where a hunter had finally seen the truth, and where, for the first time, he chose not to pull the trigger. A sudden noise shattered the stillness. Jacob's head snapped to the side, his instincts kicking in before his mind could catch up. Distant voices, the rustling of leaves, someone else was nearby. His pulse quickened. Other hunters. His stomach twisted as he realized what that meant. If they found this gorilla, they wouldn't hesitate. They wouldn't see what he had seen. They would do what he had spent his entire life doing. His fingers tensed around the rifle, but not with the same purpose as before. This time, it wasn't to kill. It was to protect. The silverback remained motionless, still watching him, unaware of the approaching danger. The baby clung tighter to its father's fur, sensing the shift in the air. Jacob's mind raced. He had minutes, maybe seconds, before the other hunters got too close. His body moved before his thoughts could fully form. He took a step back, then another, deliberately snapping a branch beneath his boot. The sharp crack echoed through the jungle. The silverback flinched but didn't run. Jacob gritted his teeth and did it again, louder this time, sending birds fluttering from the trees. If he could make enough noise, if he could startle the gorilla into moving, it might escape before the others arrived. The silverback tilted its head, as if trying to understand his intentions. Another rumble, low, questioning. Jacob's chest tightened. Go, run. He didn't have the words, but he willed the gorilla to understand. Another step back, another deliberate noise, another warning that something dangerous was coming. And then, as if finally understanding, the silverback turned. It didn't rush, didn't panic, just moved with the same quiet power it had shown all along. The baby clung to its back as it disappeared into the dense jungle, fading into the safety of the wild. Jacob exhaled, the weight in his chest lifting slightly. Just as the last shadow of the gorilla disappeared, the other hunters arrived. Rough voices, rifles slung over shoulders, eyes scanning the trees. "Did you see anything?" one of them asked. Jacob hesitated. His mouth felt dry. He glanced back at the trees where the silverback had vanished. The answer should have been easy. The old Jacob would have pointed them in the right direction, led them straight to their prize. But now, standing there with the jungle pressing in around him, he realized something. He wasn't the same man anymore. "No," he said finally, shaking his head. "Nothing here." The hunters grumbled, cursed their bad luck, and moved on. Jacob stood still, listening as their footsteps faded into the distance. For the first time in his life, he had done the right thing. And for the first time, it felt like he was truly free. That night, Jacob sat alone by the dying embers of his fire, staring into the darkness of the jungle. The sounds of the night surrounded him, the distant calls of animals, the whispering rustle of leaves, but his mind was somewhere else. His fingers traced the worn edge of his rifle, the same weapon that had once felt like an extension of his own body. Now it felt foreign, heavy in a different way. He had spent years believing he was in control, that the jungle was his for the taking. But today, everything had changed. The silverback's gaze was burned into his memory. It had looked at him not with fear, not with hate, but with something deeper, understanding. As if it had seen the war inside him and knew the choice he had made, a choice he never thought he would make. For the first time in his life, he felt guilt. Real, aching guilt, not just for today, but for every hunt before it, for every life he had taken without a second thought. He had told himself it was survival, that it was just the way of the world. But the truth was something else entirely. He had been wrong. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows against the trees. He thought of the baby gorilla, of the way it had clung to its father. He thought of his own father, the man who had first put a rifle in his hands and taught him how to track, how to kill. His father had always told him that the jungle was a place of power, that only the strong survived. But maybe strength wasn't about taking life. Maybe it was about knowing when to spare it. Jacob took a slow breath, the weight in his chest shifting. He had a choice. He could keep going down the same path, ignoring what he had felt today, or he could do something different. Something right. The rifle sat beside him, unmoving, untouched. For the first time in years, he wondered if he would ever pick it up again. Days passed, but the moment in the jungle never left Jacob's mind. The silverback's eyes haunted him, a silent reminder of the choice he had made. He found himself wandering through the trees with a different purpose, not hunting, not tracking, but observing. For the first time, he truly saw the jungle for what it was, not a battlefield, not a business, but a world filled with life, struggling to survive just as he had all these years. One evening, as he sat by the river washing his hands, he noticed something in the water, a reflection of himself. His face was tired, lined with years of choices he could never undo. But there was something else there too, a question. A challenge. What now? He had spent his life taking, But maybe it wasn't too late to give something back. He knew the poacher's trails, the buyers, the networks. He knew how they worked, how they thought, and for the first time he realized he could use that knowledge for something more than survival. That night, he packed his belongings, but he left his rifle behind. He didn't need it anymore. Instead, he carried something else, a purpose. He had spent years thinking the jungle was his enemy, but now he saw the truth. It was never the jungle he had been fighting. It was himself. As the sun rose over the treetops, Jacob stepped into a new path. Not as a poacher, not as a hunter, but as a man determined to protect the very thing he had once tried to destroy. And somewhere, deep in the jungle, a silverback gorilla watched over its young, unaware that it had changed a man's life forever. Years passed, but Jacob never returned to the man he once was. The rifle remained untouched, collecting dust in a corner of the small wooden cabin he now called home. His hands, once steady on the trigger, were now used for something else, guiding, protecting, rebuilding. He became something he never thought possible, a guardian of the jungle. He worked with rangers, tracking poaching routes, exposing illegal traders, and dismantling the same networks he had once relied on for survival. The same instincts that had made him a successful hunter now made him an even better protector. He knew where traps would be set, where hunters would hide, and one by one, he helped put an end to them. But more than that, he had found something deeper, a connection. To the land, to the animals, to something beyond himself. He spent hours watching the jungle not with the eyes of a predator, but with the quiet reverence of someone who finally understood its value. One day, deep in the forest, he spotted a familiar shape in the distance, a massive silverback standing tall among the trees. Jacob froze, breath catching in his throat. Could it be? The gorilla turned, locking eyes with him, and for a fleeting moment, he swore he recognized it. The same quiet strength, the same unshakable presence. The baby was no longer a baby. It was a young gorilla now, standing beside its father, growing into the wild it was meant to call home. Jacob felt something swell in his chest. Not fear, not regret, but something else, a kind of peace he had never known. He gave the slightest nod, a silent gesture of respect, and then, just as before, the silverback turned and disappeared into the jungle, leaving Jacob standing there, knowing that their story had come full circle. The jungle had given him something he never expected, not just a second chance, but a purpose. And in the end, it wasn't the gorilla who had been spared that day. It was Jacob.